Early morning of July 2, 2008, two unmarked Mi-17 helicopters came to the landing area in Guaviare, where one of them, carrying Colombian agents wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, landed in central Colombia, right in the middle of the Amazonian jungle of the Guaviare department. Several hostages, numbering 15 people, go inside the helicopter and fly away in an unknown direction. Today this rescue mission is known as Operation Jaque. Among the hostages is Ingrid Betancourt, at that time one of the potential presidential candidate of Colombia. Today in the video you will understand why during campaigning in Southern Colombia on February 23, 2002, Ingrid Betancourt was kidnapped and was held by force in the heart of the Amazon jungle for 6 years. And you will also learn about some skeletons in the closet around this well-known story of survival. Watch carefully. Ingrid Betancourt was born in December 25, 1961 in Bogotá, Colombia. Her mother, Yolanda Pulicio, a former beauty queen, served in Congress of Colombia. Betancourt's father, Gabriel Betancourt, was also a politician, holding important positions under several presidents of the Republic. From the Minister of Education to the Ambassador to France. Being the child of very wealthy parents, little Ingrid has attended private school in France, a boarding school in England, and the Liceo Francis in Bogotá. Then Betancourt attended the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, commonly known as Sciences Po. Seriously interested in politics, Ingrid Betancourt married French citizen Fabrice Deloy in 1983. He served in the French diplomatic corps. The couple lived in multiple countries, including Ecuador, the Seychelles, and the United States of America. In the mid-1990s, Betancourt divorced with her husband. She returned to Colombia and became advisor to the Minister of Finance, and later to the Minister of Foreign Trade. Ingrid's political career does not begin at the most favorable time for the country. Since the 80s, the Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar has gained incredible strength. Having monopolized the cocaine market, bribing authorities, brutal reprisals, racketeering, money laundering, and kidnappings are becoming commonplace things in Colombia. The cartel plunges Colombia into global bloody terror. On April 30, 1984, the current Minister of Justice of Colombia, Lara Bonilla, was shot in his car in the middle of the road by two terrorists on motorcycles. Obviously, Bloody Don Pablo did not like this minister because of his campaign against drug trafficking and extradition. In 1989, Luis Carlos Galán, a candidate for the Colombian presidency, running on an anti-drug trafficking platform, was assassinated. Betancourt's mother was a supporter of Galán, and she was standing immediately behind him when he was shot dead. Betancourt was elected to the Chamber of Representatives in 1994, against all odds. During her term, she criticized the administration of President Ernesto Samper, who was accused of corruption in the 8,000 process scandal, after accepting money from the Cali drug cartel. In 1997, Betancourt launched a political party, which named the Green Oxygen Party, as an alternative to the traditional conservative and liberal parties. Betancourt ran for senator in the 1998 election, and the total number of votes she received was the largest of any candidate in a Senate election. That same year, the presidential election was ultimately won by Andrés Pastrana. Pastrana persuaded Betancourt to endorse him, and she campaigned for him under the agreement of an anti-corruption electoral reform to be adopted during his presidential term. The electoral reform was aborted due to strong pressures from the traditional parties and lack of commitment from the government. Betancourt withdrew her support of the government and joined the opposition forces. Meanwhile, civil war continues in Colombia. It began in May 1963 between the Colombian government, paramilitary groups, crime syndicates, and leftist guerrillas for influence and power in the country. Historically, the civil war was a continuation of La Violencia, the armed struggle between conservatives and liberals from 1948 to 1958. The victory of the conservatives in this struggle led to the unification of liberal and communist militants into the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. Research estimates that 220,000 people died in the conflict between 1958 and 2013, most of them civilians, and more than 5 million civilians were forced from their homes between 1985 and 2012. Which role does the FARC play in this film, and what is it? This is a left-wing extremist rebel group operating in Colombia and neighboring Venezuela. Initially it acted as a partisan unit, and later in the 1980s, it also began to engage in drug trafficking and hostage kidnapping. The FARC also claimed responsibility for terrorist attacks, bombings in the country's cities, and assassinations of politicians. At its peak in the 1990s, the FARC People's Army numbered around 17,000 fighters, both men and women, supported by a large part of the population, the so-called civilian militia, supplying them with food, medicine, and information, with an international network capable of maintaining operational communications with other countries and ideological allies. The rebels controlled 45% of Colombian territory and even constituted a threat to Bogotá. The rebels, according to government data, were involved in the production and sale of drugs, kidnapping people for ransom, and forcing teenagers to fight against the government. The FARC leads Colombia in the number of kidnapped people. Hostages are taken primarily to obtain ransom and as a tool to influence the government of the country. In Las Delicias, on August 30, 1996, about 400 FARC guerrillas attacked a military base, killing 34 soldiers, wounding 17 and taking about 60 hostages. On March 2, 1998, a major attack occurred in the city of El Bilar, where a Colombian army battalion was ambushed by guerrillas, killing 62 soldiers and capturing 43. Other FARC attacks against police bases in Miraflores, Guaviare, and La Uribe in August 1998 killed more than 100 soldiers, police, and civilians. In March 1999, the FARC executed 3 Americans whom the guerrillas accused of belonging to the CIA. On January 17, 2002, far-right militants entered the village of Chinca and divided the villagers into 2 groups. Then they went from person to person in one of the groups and smashed each person's head with sledgehammers and rocks, killing 24 people. The Colombian military did nothing. 2 more bodies were later found dumped in a shallow grave. After the massacre, the militants set the village on fire. Of course, the violence that engulfed Colombia had to end sooner or later. However, then-President Andrés Pastrana, instead of trying to extinguish the conflict by force, was only able to negotiate with FARC commanders to create a demilitarized zone in the El Caguán River Basin, a jungle region in south-central Colombia, to negotiate a possible peace process. This zone, or DMZ, existed for 3 years, from 1999 to 2002. Although the DMZ was called as a laboratory of peace, in practice the FARC continued its activities of kidnapping, military attacks, weapons purchases, and even the construction of roads and airstrips for drug trafficking. Critics believe the DMZ had become a safe haven, in which the FARC would impose its will as law, carrying out military attacks and terrorist attacks outside the DMZ, before returning to it to avoid direct confrontation with government military forces. Alvaro Uribe, the elected president in 2002, was supposed to finish the endless carnage in the country. Uribe called on the peasants to create their own units for self-defense, armed them, guaranteed police assistance, and called to smash everyone who attacks with weapons, without looking at the uniform and banner. Uribe reorganized the army and coordinated it with peasant self-defense, trained special forces with the help of the Americans, and sent them against the rebels. However, during the president's first term, the security situation in Colombia was extremely fragile. Authorities have done very little to address the country's structural problems such as poverty and inequality, perhaps in part due to political conflicts between the administration and Colombia's Congress. Let's go back to May 2001, when a young Ingrid Betancourt began her presidential campaign. She goes there with bus tour across the country to encourage people to vote for her. As part of 2002 presidential campaign, Betancourt decided to visit the DMZ town of San Vicente del Caguán to support its mayor, a member of the Green Oxygen Party. Meanwhile, the peace process with the FARC collapsed, the demilitarized zone was brought to an end, and while incumbent President Pastrana launched Operation Thanatos to retake the territory. At the time Betancourt decided to go there, the Colombian army was deployed to the area in an attempt to drive out the FARC guerrillas. President Pastrana gave them 48 hours to leave the area, which expired. At the same time, the government advised Betancourt to abandon her mission in San Vicente del Caguin. Finally, Ingrid Betancourt was determined to make the trip to the risky location. Meanwhile, peace talks to end the Colombian Civil War have stalled after more than 3 years of attempts to bring peace. From the outset, the FARC did not agree to a truce for the duration of the negotiations, nor to the peace negotiations being overseen by various representatives of the international community. Moreover, at this time hundreds of civilians were kidnapped in different cities and rural areas of the country. Then they were transported back to the DMZ, where they were kept in cages. Many of them kidnapped for the purpose of economic extortion, others for political reasons. As a consequence, President Andres Pastrana canceled negotiations with the FARC and annulled the demilitarized zone, arguing the FARC had betrayed the terms of the negotiations and were using the DMZ to strengthen their military and logistics capabilities. Despite the army's refusal to airlift Betancourt to San Vicente, she decided to drive and was provided with a government vehicle. On February 23, 2002, Betancourt's car, along with Clara Rojas, her campaign manager, was stopped at the last military checkpoint before entering the former demilitarized zone. According to Betancourt's kidnapper, Nalberto Univega, Betancourt ended up at a FARC checkpoint where she was kidnapped. He said her kidnapping was not planned in advance, but happened after the presidential candidate came to terrorists herself. Of course, given the reputation of the FARC, this became like a red rag near the face. They couldn't help but take the chance. Ever since the days of the Pastrana negotiations, when a limited exchange took place, the FARC have demanded the formalization of a mechanism for prisoner exchange. The mechanism would involve the release, the FARC terms its political hostages in exchange for most jailed guerrillas, numbering about 500 people. For the FARC, most of its other hostages, those held for extortion purposes and which would number at least 1,000, would not be considered subject to such an exchange. The newly elected Uribe administration initially ruled out any negotiation with the group that would not include a ceasefire. Instead pushed for rescue operations, many of which have traditionally been successful when carried out by the police's called GAULA, anti-kidnapping group in urban settings, but not in the mountains and jungles where the FARC keeps most prisoners, according to official statistics and mainstream news reports. Relatives of most of FARC's hostages, including Betancourt's, came to strongly reject any potential rescue operations. Especially after the death of the governor of the Antioquia department, Guillermo Gaviria, his peace advisor and several soldiers, kidnapped by the FARC during a peace march in 2003. The governor and the others were shot at close range by the FARC when the government launched an army rescue mission into the jungle, which failed as the guerrillas learned of its presence in the area. A day after Betancourt's kidnapping, several non-governmental organizations under the lead of Armand Burgett were organized in the European Union and around the world to establish an association or committee for the liberation of Ingrid Betancourt. The committee initially consisted of nearly 280 activists in 39 countries. 1 month after her kidnapping, her father Gabriel died of heart and respiratory trouble. In July 2003, Operation named July 14th was launched. It was organized by French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin. The mission failed to make contact with FARC to liberate Betancourt and caused a scandal for the French government. A video of Betancourt was released by FARC in August 2003. In August 2004, the Uribe government, seeming to have gradually relaxed own position, announced it had given the FARC a formal proposal on July 23, in which it offered to free 50 to 60 jailed rebels, in exchange for the political and military hostages held by the FARC group, not including economic hostages, as the government had earlier demanded. In February 2006, France urged the FARC to seize the chance offered by a European proposed prisoner swap, accepted by Bogotá, and free dozens it had held for up to 7 years. However, Ingrid was still held hostage. In May 2007, a captured Colombian National Police Superintendent, John Frank Pinchao, escaped from FARC captivity and claimed Betancourt was being held in the same prison camp he had been in. Soon after, President Álvaro Uribe reiterated his orders for the rescue by military means of Betancourt and other political figures. Shortly after taking office in mid-May, French President Nicolas Sarkozy asked Uribe to release FARC's Chancellor Rodrigo Granda in exchange for Betancourt. On June 4, 30 incarcerated members from the FARC were liberated as a goodwill gesture by the government to pursue the liberation of Betancourt and others. However, this did not result in her freedom again. In 2008, the president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, with the initial permission of the Colombian government and the participation of the International Red Cross, organized humanitarian operations in order to receive several civilian hostages, whose release had been announced by FARC. The first operation led to the release of Clara Rojas and Consuelo Gonzalez. Emmanuel, Rojas's son, born in captivity, had been freed previously after a stunning declaration from President Uribe, where it was discovered the infant was left in a foster home after being severely mistreated by the guerrillas. On February 27, a second operation was carried out, freeing 4 former members of the Colombian Congress. However, Ingrid Betancourt was still not among them. The time has finally come when Betancourt must be saved. On July 2, 2008, current Minister of Defense and the future President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, called a press conference to announce the rescue of Betancourt and other 14 captives. The operation that won their freedom, codenamed Jaque. It translated from French like check in the chess game. Early morning of July 2, 2008, the hostages were moved across the river to a landing zone, where they were told by their captors they were going to be moved to a different location. Two Mi-17 helicopters came to the landing area in Guaviare, where one, carrying Colombian agents wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, landed to pick up the hostages. In total, the helicopters spent 22 minutes on the ground, during which time the hostages were handcuffed and loaded aboard. The pilot and co-pilot communicated with fellow security personnel in code. The local FARC commander, known as Cesar, and an additional rebel boarded the helicopters along with the hostages. They were persuaded to hand over their pistols and were subdued in the air by Colombian forces. Later, Betancourt told on a press conference, she at first has had no idea she was being rescued until she has heard the saving words,
"Somos el Ejército Nacional. Ustedes están en libertad."
Santos said the FARC rebels had been tricked into handing over the hostages by soldiers, posing as members of a fictitious non-government organization that supposedly would fly the captives to a camp to meet rebel leader Alfonso Cano. To prepare for the role, they took acting classes for a week and a half. 2 soldiers posed as fellow guerrilla fighters, and 4 troops dressed as aid workers. Several aspects of the mission were apparently designed to mimic previous Venezuelan hostage transfers, including the actual composition of the group and the type and markings of the helicopters used. In case of failure, Colombia had prepared an armada of 39 helicopters to ferry 2,000 troops plus U.S. advisors. The liberated Betancourt thanked the Colombian Armed Forces and President Álvaro Uribe and gave her approval to Uribe's 3rd term as a president. However, her gratitude did not last long. In June 2010, Betancourt requested from the Colombian justice, as other Colombian hostages previously had, monetary compensation under the Colombian law of protecting victims of terrorism. Colombian Vice President Francisco Santos said that the lawsuit deserved a world prize for greed, ungratefulness, and gall. Betancourt withdrew her claim for compensation, expressing her indignation at the way in which her undertaking had been distorted and the public opinion manipulated. Sometime later, in the book titled Out of Captivity, American Northrop Grumman contractors with Mark Gonzalez, Keith Stansell, and Thomas House, all of them spent time as hostages with Betancourt, described her behavior while a captive of FARC as selfish, as was her belief she deserved better treatment than the other captives owing to her political and social standing. The Americans, held captive by the FARC from 2003 to 2008, stated throughout their captivity Betancourt claimed and took more than her fair share of scarce food, clothing, and personal space. Stansell said that he can get over just about anything, But he don't know about Ingrid. Forgive? Yes. Move on? Yes. Respect? No. Mark Gonzalez has defended Betancourt and stated that for him she is a courageous person. She behaved like only heroes do. This is why he is so hurt with Keith's attacks. Betancourt declined to comment on the Americans' allegations. Despite her experiences, Ingrid Betancourt continued to defend her active citizenship to engage in political activities that ultimately led her back to the presidential election campaign in 2022. On January 18, 2022, she announced her candidacy for the 2022 Colombian presidential election, in which she finished 7th.